Welcome back to Bedtime Myths and Mysteries. Tonight we're stepping onto paths that were never meant for human feet. Across Britain there are old roads, trails, and narrow stretches of land that locals once avoided after sunset. They weren't dangerous because of thieves or wild animals. They were dangerous because of something far stranger. For centuries, people believed that unseen beings traveled certain routes through the countryside. Invisible roads stretching across fields, through forests, over hills, and sometimes straight through houses and villages. These were known as fairy paths. And according to folklore, if you happened to stand in the way when the fair folk were passing through, you might never return home at all. So dim the lights, settle in, and listen carefully. Because tonight we're exploring the fairy paths of Britain, the roads you should never walk at night. In the quiet countryside of Britain, long before electric lights and busy roads, the land was believed to belong to more than just people. Villagers spoke in hushed voices about the hidden folk who lived beneath hills, inside ancient mounds, and deep within forests. These beings were known by many names: the fair folk, the good neighbors, the people of the hills. But one belief appeared again and again across different regions: the idea that the fair folk traveled along invisible routes across the land. These were fairy paths. A fairy path was said to be a kind of invisible road, a straight line connecting important places in the fairy world. Ancient hills, burial mounds, standing stones, and old forests. The paths often stretched for miles, sometimes crossing rivers, fields, and even villages. And according to tradition, the fair folk traveled these routes at night. No one could see them clearly. But sometimes people claimed to hear strange sounds drifting across the dark countryside. Soft music, laughter, whispering voices carried on the wind. And the most important rule was simple: never stand in the way of a fairy path. Because if you did, the consequences could be very strange indeed. There are old stories from Ireland and Scotland of houses built directly across these invisible roads. The builders had no idea they had placed a wall across a fairy route. Soon after moving in, the families would begin to notice strange disturbances. Doors opening in the night, furniture shifting without explanation, strange knocking sounds echoing through the house. In some stories, milk would sour overnight. Bread would vanish from the kitchen. Animals would refuse to enter certain rooms. The belief was simple: the house was blocking the fairy road. And the fair folk were not pleased. One famous example comes from the countryside of Western Ireland. A farmer built a new cottage on land that had been empty for generations. Shortly after moving in, strange things began to happen. Every night at the same hour, the wind would howl through the house even when the air outside was calm. Candles would flicker violently. The doors would rattle. And the family claimed to hear footsteps moving through the rooms. Finally, an elderly neighbor visited the house and quietly asked the farmer a question. Had anyone checked whether the cottage stood on a fairy path? The farmer laughed at first, but the old woman explained that the front door and the back door lined up perfectly with two distant hills. According to local folklore, those hills were ancient fairy mounds. The cottage stood directly between them. Right across the road the fair folk used to travel. The solution was unusual. The farmer removed the door at the back of the house and replaced it with a wide open archway. From that night forward, the disturbances stopped. The fair folk, it seemed, had been given a clear passage through the building. Stories like this appear all across Britain. In Wales, Some farmers refused to build barns or stone walls in perfectly straight lines between ancient hills. In Scotland, certain narrow lanes were avoided after sunset because locals believed they formed part of fairy routes. Even in parts of England, builders once left small gaps between structures so the fair folk could pass through unhindered. And then there were the stories about travelers who ignored the warnings. One tale describes a man walking home late at night along a lonely country path. As he reached a narrow clearing between two hills, he suddenly heard music drifting through the darkness. At first it was faint. Then it grew louder. Flutes, bells, and voices singing in a language he could not understand. The sound seemed to be moving toward him. The man froze. The old stories rushed back into his mind. Fairy paths. Without hesitation, he stepped off the trail and pressed himself against the side of a tree. The music passed directly in front of him. Though he could see nothing, he felt a strange wind brush across his face. Leaves trembled. The grass bent as if something unseen moved through it. And then the sound faded into the distance. When the man finally returned to the path, he hurried home without looking back. He never walked that route again after dark. Whether these stories are warnings, imagination, or echoes of something older is impossible to know. But even today, in parts of rural Britain, people still speak quietly about fairy paths. Builders sometimes adjust roads to avoid certain lines across the landscape. Farmers leave small gaps between fields. And some travelers still step aside if a lonely trail feels strangely alive in the darkness. Just in case. Because according to the old traditions, the fair folk still travel their roads. And if you ever find yourself standing in the middle of one of those invisible paths, it might be wise to move out of the way. And that is the legend of Britain's fairy paths. Invisible roads said to cross hills, forests, and villages. Paths that some believe are still traveled after dark. If you enjoyed tonight's story, don't forget to subscribe to Bedtime Myths and Mysteries for more forgotten legends, eerie folklore, and mysterious stories from around the world. Until next time, sleep well.